Good morning to all of you. I'm Shlomo Avineri from Jerusalem, from Al-Quds, if you wish. And we have a very distinguished panel this morning dealing with one of the issues which has dramatically changed the region and has in the last few years caught the attention of everybody outside the region as well. Let me start by making two brief comments about the Arab Spring and the developments in the Middle East in the last 3 years. First of all, let us suggest what happened and what did not happen. The Arab Spring, starting in Tunisia, later in Egypt, and we will hear later how complex those developments were and how complex the outcome is, did, however, do something that happened for the first time in the region. When in 1989, waves of democratization in Gulf, Central and Eastern Europe, and also Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, there was a conventional wisdom shared by scholars as well as politicians that there is an Arab exceptionalism, that this is not happening in the Arab world, those waves of democratization, while they are happening all over the world. This happened not to be true. What happened in the Arab world in the last 3 or 4 years is analogous, if you wish, to what happened in other areas, with due differences, obviously. But it happened. It happened perhaps late, but it happened. For the first time, and one has to realize it, for the first time, Arab governments, authoritarian governments, were either brought down in Tunisia and in Egypt and in a way in Yemen, also in a much complicated way, of course, in Libya, and in Syria were challenged by popular demonstrations, mass demonstrations. This is the first time that Arab governments were brought down, not through a military coups, through behind the cloaks deals, but through popular demonstrations in a massive way in a number of countries. And this happened for the first time. On the other hand, it didn't happen in all the countries. It didn't happen in all the countries of the Arab League. It happened in countries which have some very specific characteristics. The regimes which were brought down or challenged were basically in the origins military dictatorships which became civilianized and became republics. What did not happen in some of the monarchies in the Arab world, which were traditionally conventional, conservative, and in some cases were as repressive as some of the regimes which were brought down. And when you ask yourself, why is the difference? It seems to me, and this can be, of course, discussed and even challenged, it seems to me that what happened is that the regimes which were challenged or brought down basically lacked legitimacy. Whereas when you go to countries like Morocco and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf countries, Bahrain is a very specific and different issue, those countries, those regimes, the dynastic historical regimes, had legitimacy. They were also, because they had legitimacy, able to co-opt much more easier than military republican regimes which lacked legitimacy. We have seen in Morocco a very interesting development, and it's not that the countries where changes didn't happen or revolutions didn't happen were more or less repressive, not so. But they had legitimacy, and there's no doubt that in a case like Morocco, or in the case of Jordan, the fact that the ruling monarch is considered to be a descendant of the Prophet added to the legitimacy and made it much more difficult to challenge it. Saudi Arabia being the custodian of the two holy places of Islam, and also being a very rich country, but basically it had legitimacy because of its role as the custodian of the two holy places. Saudi Arabia may be rich, Morocco is not very rich, and Jordan is certainly not a very rich country. So it's not socio-economic differences, it has to do with legitimacy. And the fact that the regimes have legitimacy, not necessarily democratic legitimacy, but they do have legitimacy, they're not concerned as upstarts and illegitimate, really helped. The other thing is, of course, that 3 years later, we see that the great hopes that were sometimes overstated and overpropagated by the CNN and Al Jazeera effect, because we saw massive demonstrations, we saw young people challenging, sometimes with some danger to their own life and security. The hopes for democracy and democratization didn't help. And we have seen a much more complicated development in Egypt. Tunisia is slightly different. And we have seen, in the case of Syria, demonstrations that started as popular demonstrations, descending very quickly into a very awful and bloody civil war. And one of the consequences of this is that if we look today, 3 years later, at what's happening in the Middle East, is that we see not only regime changes, and not of them as hopeful as many thought, we see also the disintegration of some of the states. The state system is changing. And this, of course, raises the issue that the state system, as we know it in the Middle East, has been, to a very large extent, an outcome of imperial decisions before World War I, and especially after World War I, in Middle Eastern parlance, Sykes-Picot. Syria and Iraq have been set up as nation-states, and the borders were drawn, sometimes in a very straight line, by imperial planners, imperial statesmen, without regard to history, geography, ethnicity, religious traditions, and the very idea of a separate Syria, a separate Iraq, a separate Lebanon, is something that didn't go out of political movements out of those countries, but of imperial decisions. And Iraq, partly out of the outcome of the American invasion, part of the outcome of the quest of the Kurdish minority for autonomy, has not been anymore a consolidated state as it was under Saddam Hussein. In Syria, nobody knows what's going to be the end result, but certainly the coherence of Syria as a nation state, as it was for many, many decades, is put in question. In Libya, post-Gaddafi, there has been an inability to create a coherent polity, having to do with the fact that Libya as an entity was set up by the Italian occupiers before World War I, when they occupied two provinces, Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, from the Ottoman Empire. Sudan, also an outcome of British imperial designs, has already split. South Sudan, again, not the end of the story, and there is still the open issue of Darfur. Of course, Egypt is different because Egypt is an historical entity going back in a coherent way, thousands and thousands of years. The territorial integrity of Egypt is not questioned and is not challenged. But around Egypt, the countries of the Levant, Sham, and of course Libya and Sudan are not what they were before. And I think we have to look at what happened in the Middle East in this respect to a similar way to what happened in Central and Eastern Europe. Not only the communist regimes and the Soviet Union, the Soviet ascendancy was put to an end here 25 years ago, but the state system out of the Soviet Union, 15 republics. Out of Yugoslavia, 6 or 7, depends how you count. And even in the case of Czechoslovakia, a very velvet and very peaceful separation, but it did happen. So it's not just regime changes which occurred, but also the state system. And to have to discuss those issues, we have, as I said, a very remarkable panel of experts, and I ask each of them to start with an opening statement of 5 to 8 minutes. And I'm going slightly in a different order from the one which we have originally at the request of some of the people. And I'd like very much to ask Youssef Amrani from Morocco, who comes with a lot of experience, international experience, and also experience in the royal court, to address those issues, precisely because Morocco has been going on through a very quiet transformation, a very interesting cooptation. It's not very much in the news because it wasn't violent, but it is a process. Youssef Amrani, please.
Well, thank you very much. Let me, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think today we have a specific context in the region. The Arab Spring has created new expectations. Arab Spring has brought changes to the region. And we need to be at the level of these expectations. I think this is one of the major issues we are facing today in the Arab world. I will speak maybe basing my, in the region, in the North Africa region. I will leave the other colleagues speak about other issues in the region on the Arab Spring. But let me say at the beginning that today we have an Arab world in construction, still in construction, because democracy is not something that's easy. Democracy could not be imposed. Democracy is a culture, and democracy needs time, and needs also tools and institutions. Like you were saying before, the experience of the Central European countries. You had the European Union supporting you. You had tools, financial tools to access, not only to markets, but also to tools on the neighborhood policy, and we can talk about it if you want to do so. But you had a long experience in building up democracy. It's not something that you can invent from one day to another. Let me make two comments, brief comments. One, although all the Arab countries face the same challenges, the Arab Spring has highlighted, I think, a very important point. There is, like they say in America, there is no one size fits all. Every country must go according to its priorities, to its substract, to its rhythm, to its path, and to the composition of its population. It's important. However, we must always have in mind today that in the Arab world, two cardinal parameters are essential. The respect, and Mustafa was yesterday insisting on it, the respect of the independence of the country, their national unity, and their territorial integrity. Otherwise, we will ruin the whole thing. This is something, I think, something that is essential. Two, second point is, I think that the desired changes we all want will be made and will take place differently from one country to another. Because the Arab world is not homogeneous. We have some dimension. Today we have the Islamic dimension in our countries. We have the Amazigh dimension and the Kurd dimension in our... So this is, I think, every country must... Let me now, a third point maybe. I think it is our own responsibility as Arabs to build up our future. But also, I have to note that today, the international community, and this issue was not tackled during these 2 days, failed to bring the solutions to the issues that we are facing today. I'm talking especially about the Middle East peace process. I'm talking also about Syria. We were in the Security Council, myself, for the last 2 years, and the Security Council was divided and could not bring any input or any added value to the resolution of conflict in Syria. There's something I think we must have in mind. My fourth comment also, I think was before tackling the issue, the example of Morocco, is the process of regional integration. And we have to make our own homework as Arabs. We have failed to build up in our region coherent regional organizations that can face these challenges. One country itself cannot face all these challenges alone. If we were together, whether in the Maghreb Arab, the 5 countries, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Mauritania, we could have faced now today. There's a big security threat in the Maghreb. And one country alone cannot face the challenges. Al-Qaeda today is still strong in the Maghreb. The situation, I will talk about it very briefly, in Libya today is very dangerous, is of great concern, not only to the Maghreb Arab countries, but to the Sahel countries and to the European Union. Because at the end of the day, Libya, the Maghreb, are the door to Europe. And this morning, Mustafa was telling me we should maybe, why not tackle the issue of the Barcelona process and the regional approach towards the region. I think this is also one point that we must address. Even the Barcelona process, we're now not able to move forward in the reform changes. So today, I think we are facing a difficult context in the region, with the Europe in crisis, Europe not giving priority to the Mediterranean. Europe is coming today with a new commission, with a new European Parliament, where issues of democracy are essential, are important. And I think for us, as far as Morocco is concerned, this Arab Spring constitutes an opportunity for all of us to assess and to maybe to draw new perspectives for our people. I would like also, to give from the Moroccan perspective an example, because Morocco is not a country of the Arab Spring, because we have started the reform process since a long time ago. And you were, Shlomo, talking about legitimacy, and I think this is, and the identity of the countries, and the identity is important. So today, I think I would like to tell you who we are and where we want to go. I think we must have a clear vision where you want to go and what you want to achieve. Of course, this gathering offers us the opportunity to exchange with no complex, no taboo, concerning our shared challenges. I think we have some shared challenges. And the challenges are like how to stimulate growth. It's important. You cannot only talk about democracy, political reforms, without speaking about the economy. Because at the end of the day, what is important is how much job you create to meet the expectation of the young generation, and women also. And how to respond to social inequalities, how to face the competitivity. These are the issues we should today tackle, because this is at the end of the day what is important and what stimulates growth and what creates expectation for the young generation. So we have shared challenges, but other challenges which are specific to each country. Democracy, it's a learning process. I think that's why we're here, to learn from each other, to learn our success, but also our failures. I think we have some failures to have to do. And finally, I would like to speak about Morocco, maybe briefly. I think maybe it is, we don't want to be a model in the region. We have our own experience. And I think a number of key actors make our democratic path unique and successful. First, I think it's a long-standing democratic commitment, because our democratic reform process is not something new that we have just started. It's a long process with some mistakes, of course, because we learn from our mistakes, with some successful stories, but also with some failures. But we always corrected. We stopped and we correct our failures, and try always to look forward and move forward. So it was built slowly and surely, even the independence of our country. The lesson we learned from this experience is that we never were forced into anything. And we didn't wait for the Arab Spring to think that change is a positive thing. We didn't fear change. And as you said, Shlomo, our story is of peaceful and sustained evolution rather than a revolution. And this is, I think, is thanks to the leadership and the work of the king. So we have the tools today. I think we'll be able to, and we need for democracy tools, new constitution, new instruments of good governance, fight against corruption, transparency. We have gone into this because in order to build up something coherent, you say coherent, you need to have the necessary tools like you have here in Europe or elsewhere. Of course, this new constitution with all the shared values, gender equality, democracy, respect of human rights, and well, all the democratic literature is there. But it was possible because we had an approach, a proactive approach based on participation, ownership. I think these are two key words. You need the political parties, you need the trade unions, you need the instruments in order to build up democracy, something coherent. Like today, the situation in Libya. Let me give this example. Gaddafi left, and left the country with no institution, with no constitution, with no political parties. How could you implement democracy in a kind of environment? It's chaotic. That's why Libya needs a lot of support from our partners, needs lots of work, because you cannot invent. Today we have two parliaments, two governments in Libya, and it's something very preoccupying. So our reform process, it's a purely homegrown reform process. That's why I said every country must have its own. And this was possible because we had a clear vision for the future. The driving force is this vision. And also, I think, the approach. We had to walk on our two legs in order not to fall. The political development, democracy is one, and the second is the economic development. Otherwise, this reform process should go hand in hand in order to be able to build up something that might be coherent. So this is and this, of course, all this approach reflects our needs and also our unique identity. Yes, we need yesterday, I think in the panel yesterday, we were talking about the identity, and I think this is essential. We have in Morocco, we are a nation with a strong identity. And this is when you have a strong identity, it gives you courage and confidence to engage in change and reform. And because, of course, tolerance, openness, moderation are in our nation's DNA. This is something, we always have coexistence between religion, to respect the others, and to listen to the others, like we're doing here. This is the way how you can. We are different, yes, we are different, because this vision, the approach, and the long-standing nature of our efforts are the building block of this Moroccan democratic experience. It is, if you can say, a third way, pacific, evolutionary, that has allowed us to embrace change without destabilizing the country, without our stability. And I think stability also, I think I will leave the other colleagues talk about stability, that today is something important in the Arab world and in the Muslim world. Because without stability, without security, you could not face the other challenges we are facing today. And it also demonstrates that Islam is compatible with democracy, that Islam is compatible with modernity, with human rights. What is happening today is deformation, the extremism and the radicalism today we are witnessing. We need all of us to make the same fight against the radicalism and the Islamists. This is something that we should address it through a global approach. To approach, of course, political development, democracy, economic development, but also one third dimension, which is essential, and it is for us to do it, the Muslim country, how to promote the values of the real Islam in our region through the media, because Islam has nothing to do with this barbar thing what's happening in the world. We need to have the tools, we need to have the political will in order to engage on a real debate with our civil society, with our political parties. Because at the end of the day, the extremism, the radicalism is something ecological. It's like a plant. When you have focus of instability, then the plant spreads and grows. And it is something that we have to fight against to remove all the ingredients of extremism, of radicalism. And I think this is what we are trying to do in Morocco, working with some African countries on how to promote the values of the real Islam, which is tolerant, which is... You see, we have countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. They are Muslim countries, where they were able to build up some... We didn't speak about the Asian example, but I think it is something that was cooked according to their own priorities, their own culture, and today, countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, I think, are moving in the right direction without any bloodshed and without breaking the uncertainty for the future. As I told you, I will speak about my experience, my country, which is moving, I hope, in the good direction, but we believe that we are moving in the good direction to cook something, you know, which is in conformity with our aspiration. Now, maybe as I'm here in Europe, I would like to conclude with a final comment about the neighborhood policy. I know we will have another panel to speak about neighborhood policy, but today I think Europe should give the priority to the Mediterranean and to the South region. With the reshaping the neighborhood policy, with new instruments, because you here in Central Europe, you were able to build up democracy, you will build up to access the European market because you had perspective to join the European Union. It was a driving force which helped you to transpose the acquis communautaire, to integrate the networks, European networks, and this is why the economic dimension is essential. I know that Fayyad was trying to implement more or less the same policy when he was in charge of the government of the National Palestine Authority, through economic projects, how to create expectation for the people of the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad that we have heard a voice which is not always heard in Europe. It seems to me that one of the most terrible consequences of what's happening now under Daesh, under ISIS, is that because of the terrible things which are being done by ISIS, there seems sometimes to be in the West, in Europe, a demonization of Islam, identifying Islam with the terrible things which are done by Daesh, by ISIS. And Morocco seems to me to be a good example how one can combine reform with reverence for tradition and for Islam, and how one can bring in Islamic groups and Islamic parties within the political structure and together create development and changes. And Morocco is a very, very important example here. Also, I'm very glad that Youssef Amrani mentioned that one has to look at each of those countries separately. Just as those of us who have studied Central Eastern Europe know that one cannot talk about all post-communist countries as if they are the same. They are obviously not the same. Developments are different in each of them. The same applies to countries that belong to the Arab region or to the Arab League. And last and not least, and this was said by you at the beginning, that the international community has failed. And the international community may have institutions, may have rhetoric, doesn't have adequate answers to crises like this, and we see some of the consequences. And it's not just the international community in an abstract way, it means the European Union and certainly the United States, whose position has been greatly damaged by the way in which it didn't respond to some of the developments in the area. From the Maghreb to the Mashrek, I'd like now to move. We are very happy to have Falah Mustafa Bakir. Minister Bakir is responsible for the International Relations Department of the Kurdish Regional Government, the KRG, so to speak, the foreign minister of the autonomous Kurdish region, which is a de facto state in the way in which it behaves and controls its own territory. There have been changes in the last few weeks. Relationship between KRG and the government in Baghdad are changing. And Minister Bakir, perhaps you can fill us in on what is happening in your area. Mr. Bakir,
thank you. Indeed, it's my pleasure to be here. Talking about the Arab Spring, whether we are able to judge whether it has failed or succeeded, I believe it's too early. We have to give it enough time for us to make judgments on this. We have to take each case separately so that we judge, because these have been changes that have come from within. People realize that there needs to be some change. People were demanding legitimate rights, rights that people in the Western world, in the free world, have been enjoying. So therefore, it's too early for us to make that judgment. But of course, talking about the Arab Spring and talking about each country, it depends with whom you are speaking. Which community, which component of that society are you talking to? Are you talking to the women? Are you talking to the young generation? Are you talking to those who were part of the previous regime? Or you're talking to the minorities, whether they are ethnic or religious? Therefore, it is important to whom that question is addressed. Maybe in a few years' time, we would be in a better position to make that judgment and to come up with a clear answer to this. But having said that, the entire region is witnessing change. We have to be mindful of the fact that there are certain rivalries that are ongoing in the region. Shia-Sunni power struggle, neighbor countries' power struggle, spheres of influence for countries who want to bring about change in other countries. These are all factors. Either we have to admit that these are the elements, these are the players on the ground, or we deny them. But it's much easier to throw the responsibility on others. Always, in our part of the world, we're trying to throw the responsibility and blame others for what is happening. The Middle East has got a legacy of centralization of power, of denial of other people's rights, and of monopolizing power, economic power, the social power, everything in the hands of a few at the center. We have seen cases of interferences. Each of these countries have got their own agenda in order to bring about the change they wish to see. When we talk about the Middle East, there are the power struggle, but they do not think about a win-win situation so that everybody be a winner. They are only thinking about a zero-sum game. Some people want to be the winners and others to be the losers, and this is not acceptable. Therefore, the challenge will continue. A question, is Middle East ready for democracy? Another question is Islam ready for democracy, or Islam is compatible with democracy or not? That's a big question. We have to be honest and ask ourselves that question. You mentioned ISIS. I come from an area that our women have been enslaved by ISIS. Our women have been sold in the open market by ISIS, and they do it in the name of the Islamic State. So where do I stand in that? Is that the real Islam? If that's the real Islam, then where is the other Islam? If that's not, then the Islamic world has to come forward in order to make it clear for the people. We have to establish that cultural dialogue, that religious dialogue between different religions, because I cannot accept merely some people telling me that this is not Islam, but they do it under the name of Islam. It happened to me, therefore I don't read it in books. It's my own people, it's our women who have been enslaved, who have been sold in the market, who have been raped, under the same concepts of medieval ages of Islam. So what could be done? There are two tendencies in the Middle East. A tendency towards building democracy, rule of law, social justice, empowerment of women, etc. This is what the Western democracies and universal values are. Another tendency towards Islamization, radicalization, and extremism. So we are in between two trends. Whether we would be able to find something in between, that's the question. And this is the role for the international community to come forward and help us. Of course, we're not expecting change to come from outside. Change has to come from within, and change has to be made by the people who want to bring about the change. But I agree with Mr. Amrani. He said that democracy is not a ready-made package that would be distributed among people and overnight for people to become democratic. It's a process. It takes time. But you have to lay down foundations and proper foundations for that to continue. We all have the history of the Middle East in the backdrop, and we know where we have come from. We have come from centralization, disrespect for minorities, for ethnicities, but the whole world is witnessing change. It's not only the Middle East, but the Middle East and its change is more visible to the outside world. While in the rest of the world, there is a tendency towards unity and coalition. In the Middle East, there is more tendency for separation, separatism, and identity. But the moment that identity is respected, the moment entities are realized, then there could be coalition and partnership. Not coalitions and partnerships will not be there unless recognition is there. So we have to recognize each other, we have to accept each other, then work with each other for the sake of the objectives. We have to come up with some new solutions, because if the old systems and if the old solutions had worked, we would not have reached today. So we have failed, and we have to admit that it has failed, but we think about a new settlement to the questions that we have suffered from. Good governance is important, of course, but who would be governing? That's the question. If the ruling power would claim that there's good governance, we are moving towards building democracy and democratic institution. If the rank and file, if the people, the masses, would not accept that, it's not good governance. It has to be accepted by all that this is a good governance, this is social justice, this is a free market economy, and etc. We believe time has come for the Middle East to disconnect itself with that past. Because continuing on the same path, it will bring more failure to the processes. But we are optimistic because it has provided some hope for change and some hope for optimism for the future of the Middle East. I believe there could be democracy in the region. It's not impossible, but we have to work for it. And working for that, we need partners. Partners who really want to be partners and not to have their own agenda to be imposed on the people. One of the things that we have seen it in Iraq, we have chosen federalism as a system of governance to ensure our identity is respected, to ensure partnership in the governance, but also partnership in benefiting from the resources of the country. Kurdistan region alone is rich in oil and gas, but Iraq as a whole is rich. Shia areas, they have resources. Sunni areas, they have some resources. Kurds have resources. If we all agree to share the wealth of the country and we agree on the system of governance, we will not have a problem. So some people talk about ISIS, but ISIS is not that new, but it's not that old as well. Because in 2005 and 2006, when Al-Qaeda in Iraq came in the ISIS, they declared Islamic State in Ramadi, in Anbar province. So then, after the surge, the American surge, and the Sons of Iraq defeated them, they went to Syria. With the crisis in Syria, the spillover, they came back to Iraq. So ISIS cannot be blamed for the failure of Iraq. We had two cabinets of former Prime Minister Maliki who did not do well in order to improve the system of governance, in order to attract the people to Baghdad. Indeed, they pushed people away from Baghdad. Some people were pushed toward Turkey, some others pushed toward Iran, others toward Saudi Arabia, etc. Therefore, we have to blame ourselves for the failures that we are facing, and we should not blame others for the failures that we are thinking. Media is important, and it can play an important role, and it has played. But the media is directed, is not free. Looking at some of the Arab media channels, they are depicting the situation differently in one country to another, talking about Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. Okay? Look at them, you understand which is the policy behind, which country is behind this station. So the media is playing an important role in order to promote change. But with the political motives, you would never see who is behind. Civil society institutions, these are important. People to be engaged with the Western world, to understand that they can be there, they can exist, but others can exist as well. So they should not be existing at the expense of the non-existence of others. So therefore, the resources play a role, media plays a role, civil society plays an important role, the connection with the outside world. And another weakness of the Middle East has always been the logic of minority versus majority. Majority has always wanted to rule, and minority to be a subservient, a follower, and not to have a say. This cannot continue forever, because human beings are equal, societies are equal, and entities are equal. Unless we give enough attention to social justice, to equality, and to justice, we will not be able to see the change that we want. But I believe the Middle East now has an opportunity. Yes, it is a troublesome time. Yes, there are challenges, but it's doable. It's doable. We in Kurdistan region did it, and we were hoping that in Iraq as a whole, we could do it. But unfortunately, in Iraq, we faced a dilemma. The Sunnis who were in power, they had the fear of their future. The Shias who had the fear of the past, they wanted to grab the power. And we had the fear of the past, present, and future because we are not a majority and we don't know how each of these groups would treat us. The moment we can build trust, the moment we can build partnership, we will be able to proceed. So I hope there would be more interaction between the Middle East and the Arab Spring countries with the outside world so that we give an opportunity for the voices of the unheard. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Bakir. Also for bringing in the issue of pluralism. Not only is each country in the Middle East different, but within the countries. Not all of them are uniform countries. There are pluralism there. And the idea of a nation state that has minorities which are different is a very problematic issue. And we have to realize now that if there's going to be a change in the state system, it will not only mean, or may not only mean borders probably, but also the internal structure relating to issues of minority majorities. And the idea of a uniform Jacobin nation state is not the only model that is working in Europe for this matter, and certainly not in the Middle East. Our next speaker is Salam Fayyad, an economist, a former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. And Salam, perhaps you can bring in the Palestinian approach or the Palestinian perspective to what has been happening in the Arab world in the last few years. Please.
Thank you very much. This is a majestic hall, but the acoustics are not really that good, so forgive me if I misquote someone here. I was trying to listen very carefully. I don't know what it is like for the audience. I will not speak too long to really make it possible for us to have a little bit of an interactive discussion with the audience. But let me first say that I somewhat disagree with the title of the session, pretty much like our friend Mr. Amr Musa yesterday disagreed with the title of the session that we were together, in the sense that it sort of suggests as if we're past the Arab Spring, 3 years after the Arab Spring, and I think more accurately it should have been more after the eruption of the Arab Spring rather than. I seek to make the point here that this is more in the nature, in my view anyway, of a work in progress. It's not something that has happened as a discrete event. It's behind us, and we are in a new, decidedly different era where there is some kind of steady state equilibrium. Things are still unraveling. They will continue to, in my judgment, for some time to come, in a highly unruly way. There are reasons for this, but I fundamentally do not believe that the answer should lie, or one should look for an answer in the sphere of, well, this is somehow a different region in the sense of Arabs generally being different from other people around the world. By the way, on the first point, I agree with Mr. Bakir. He made the same point about this being still in the nature of work in progress. And when he said maybe in the future, he said next year we should be in a better position to judge it. And my own sense is that probably will take more than a year before the book is fully written on this. I think people of this region where this eruption occurred, and we are in a state where right now we're seeing aftershocks and maybe other eruptions that could be very significant, depending on how this phenomenon is dealt with by the systems of government, new regimes, if you will. But fundamentally, it's in the nature, in my estimation, of a revolution. It's not, a coup d'etat that happened in those countries, more in the nature of a revolution. Revolutions generally happen against the backdrop of unsustainability. And there is no source of unsustainability that's more influential or effective than sense of justice, injustice on the part of those who govern. In that sense, I think people of the region are similar to people elsewhere. They rebel against general feeling that there is injustice out there, and it culminates in an eruption of sorts, mild, severe, deep, violent. It varies. The contexts are different. Our context, I think, is different fundamentally, as other contexts are relative to us, not because we are different, but the context is different. Region is different in the sense of the context where there is this discontent, if you will, discontent that was reinforced greatly by the manner in which the region was dealt with internationally. Here I distance myself a bit, if I may, from the thesis of Mr. Bakir, where he says, we tend to look to others to blame for our own problems. I'm the first to fundamentally agree with the message that says, before we look for help elsewhere, we should help ourselves. We should be honest and objective in the way we assess and analyze our own problems. But I submit respectfully that this is a region that has witnessed substantially more and greater degree of interventionism in its own affairs than others. In variety of ways, for different reasons, not many. One, given global interest in it being a major source of supply of energy, in control of important passages that really mean a lot to economic stability of the world. There is, of course, the Arab-Israeli situation and the Palestinian component, the Palestinian-Israeli component of that. With that, importantly, being an Arab issue. This is something that I really have to magnify here. In the context of all of the unruliness that's taking place in the region here, there are some who argue that this could lead, if it has not led, as I do myself actually, to a great degree of marginalization to the Palestinian cause, to the Palestinian-Israeli component of this unruliness in the region. But given the hugely significant Arab dimension to this, I think that really definitely has added to those contextual factors and considerations that have reinforced this feeling of injustice, I think, and to some extent also help explain why it is that this eruption was this violent and why it is that our region has gone into this seemingly unending period of unruliness, chaos, in many parts of it, turmoil, if you will. I think along the way, and also another factor that could help explain why it is that the phenomenon that has become known as Arab Spring has taken the form it has, and it relates to my submission that there is much greater degree of interventionism in our affairs, in the regional affairs, than elsewhere in the world. I think the overall sense that there is a great deal of playing by double standards when it comes to dealing with the region. Good part of it, I think, is generally shared mindset amongst countries and peoples who have been at some point or another colonized by others. But in this particular region, there are several episodes in our history over the past 50, 60 years that actually have contributed to people generally feeling a sense of great deal of injustice, if you will, as they saw standards of the world, the powers to be, applied differently in different situations. I mentioned, by just way of example, the manner in which the world stood up in response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait back in 1990, and the manner in which the world has reacted, continues to react in an extremely lethargic way, to say the least, to the continuing Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories Israel seized in 1967. As I said, this is not a Palestinian issue. This very much has to do with the mindset of a region as a whole. This is a home issue, this domestic issue for Morocco, for Egypt, for Tunisia, for all others, for the entire region. When people of the region saw the double standard strongly implied by this reaction. For example, back in 1990, the thought on everybody's mind, well, how hypocritical. Why is it that all of a sudden the world is really doing what it's doing, etc.? I can go on, but this is another factor that I think has definitely reinforced this deep-seated and deep sense of injustice in the region, and therefore helps explain why it is that the reaction was so strong. Now, where we go from here, and I think is important and begins to really maybe shed some light as to the ultimate fate of this process. It's very hard to really see through the fog of it all. I mean, like what this region is going to really look like 10 years down the road, 20 years, 30, 40 years down the road. But some of the givens may also help us really begin to really get a handle on things. We have to take into consideration that when this phenomenon occurred, when this eruption occurred, it occurred against the backdrop of weak states and state structures that were unable to deal, for example, in the way that more advanced states were able to, insofar as the challenges posed by globalization. So this happened against the backdrop of weakness. And so what you had is something that became more akin to a state of disintegration in state structures. Not to the same degree everywhere. Different countries handle this differently. But I think the more important lesson in all of this is where do we go from here? And again, it's really important to take a good look at the role of international community in this. Not because I really want to blame everything on the world, but I think it's really our duty as part of owning up to our own responsibilities is not to sing to the tunes of the orthodoxy and established dogma and trying to deal with the problems of the region today. For example, for this, I mean, if it's a true revolution, as I think it is, and in larger response to sense of injustice, how new regimes, how new systems of government deal with the challenges facing the peoples of the region would definitely have a strong say in terms of the ultimate fate of this. Are they going to be able to successfully manage the process of transformation, the process of reform that is supposed to respond to the need that gave rise to the revolution in the first instance? There are two main spheres here one has to really keep in mind. One is the sphere of political reform, and the other is economic reform or economic change. On the first one, political reform, I think for the credibility of the revolution itself, it's important for new governments to act as swiftly as they possibly can to bring about political reform that responds to the fundamental need of people of the region to see justice, to see good governance, to see that they are governed equitably, fairly, transparently, with justice for all. For them to really understand fully the need to ensure that people of their respective countries feel enfranchised. This is very important, and there is no better way of responding to this than to act as true revolutionaries. If you are revolutionary, you're about change. Political reform, where it is needed, should be addressed quickly for people to really begin to see the difference, and importantly, to give governments a little bit more time on the other leg of this, economic reform, opportunity. Opportunity doesn't really happen overnight. Economic reforms are hard to undertake, and they take a long time for them to begin to bear fruit. And I say this with an eye on sensitizing, especially international financial institutions, by way of wanting to frontally challenge the economic orthodoxy. In those countries where there was a case of this Arab Spring, I think it's a mistake to try to adopt the orthodoxy in economic thinking in the way that you really adopt it or advise it, where there is a steady state equilibrium of sorts, where a country is going through financial difficulties, just financial difficulties, but not serious political turmoil. In the cases before us, I think it's important for governments to be allowed maximum space to spend as much as possible on modernizing infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and I mean this fully. Big projects, small projects, wherever they can be implemented. This will create jobs in the short instance, in short order, begin to give people sense of possibility about tomorrow, and will ultimately give new governments the time to implement more and more reform and give them credibility, and would contribute to imparting a greater sense of stability. What I'm really talking about here is something that that flows from my belief that people are people regardless of where they are, Latin America, Middle East, anywhere else in the world, and they respond to signals, and it's important to have them this way. But and I would close with this. I think it would be a mistake for us to really jump to quick conclusions, including, for example, that we can either be Muslim or democratic, or either democratic or with stability in a security sense. I think we should really try to challenge what seems to be a fermenting view that somehow we Arabs can't handle, you know, being this and that. I mean, I think we should really look to the experience of others. I mean, religion, whether it's Islam or other religions, is about rules, and and strict scriptures are difficult to reconcile with the unruliness of democracy. I don't think this is really an Islamic issue, an Islamic religion faith. So let's quit thinking about us somehow having to choose between being members of a certain faith or governing well on the other hand. I think we should be able to handle both. Other countries found a way in the separation, and I think that's really a good way of doing it, in a manner that really can take care of the fact that there are differences, there is differentness, but there's equality. Different but equal. And I close with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Salam Fayyad, and also mentioning the fact that one of the dilemmas, which we haven't really discussed yet, it may have to be done at a separate occasion, that on one hand you have weak states and you have very strong states, and how do you create something which is neither a weak state which is on the verge of disintegration, nor a strong state which is very centralized and authoritarian. This is one of the issues which is going to, of course, have to be addressed in the future. Now I'm going to ask Tarek Osman, who is from Egypt and has written some of the more nuanced and sophisticated analysis of developments in Egypt, and perhaps you can bring a bird's eye view on the whole developments of the region. Tarek, please.
I'm too short for bird's eye view, but I'll start with something I found quite interesting. Roughly 3 weeks ago, in a private gathering, the Middle East editor of arguably one of the most influential newspapers in the world just raised her hand when the Arab world came, and she said, it's a comprehensive mess. We don't understand it, and it's just going down. And that was exact literal quote. And in that gathering, which was extremely high, senior members of decision makers in business as well as in governments, with very few representatives from academia, there was more or less concurring with that. Yes, it is a comprehensive mess. And more or less, there was also some sort of an agreement that the entire structure that has existed in the Arab world in the past 60 or 70 years among the people, they believe that is also going down the drain, and that more or less it is utter chaos. And my observation was, but that has only been the last 2 or 3 years, because when you look at the 60 or 70 years before that, some of the same people actually who were in the room 3 weeks ago were saying, oh, the Arab world is lost because it will never change. It is the most stable part of the world. All of the rulers there are there for 30 years or longer. You had many ministers who were serving for 30 or 40 years in some cases. There was barely any change in the political structures in almost every single Arab country, with very few exceptions. In academia, and I think Shlomo made a reference to that, there was this idea of the Arab exception within the first and the second waves of democratization. Some people who were politically incorrect, if you'd like, especially in certain parts of American academia, were talking about cultural dimensions, the effect of Islam, some people were trying to say. So the idea was that, oh, this part of the world would never change. And then now, this part of the world is in constant change. And I think, yes, it is a comprehensive mess, but also it's very normal, in my opinion at least, that we have moved into this super fluid situation in the Arab world right now, because we have had, for 60 or 70 years, the waters not moving at all. And I want to draw your attention to a number of points I think are relatively important behind the current mess we are having right now. The first of them is that very, very loosely defined and bird's eye view, we've had 4 projects in the Arab world in the past 150 years, basically. The idea that the Arab world can become part of Europe, which we refer to it as Arab liberalism, which was very vibrant in the Arab world towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. Followed by the huge wave of Arab nationalism, the idea that there is unique unity features within the countries of the Arab world based on culture, based on political structures, blah, 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 blah. Followed by, or simultaneously, having a confrontation with the idea of political Islam, that Islam actually is the defining characteristic of Arab societies, and that whether we like it or not, it is the ultimate frame of reference for these societies, and therefore, by default, it is the ultimate legitimacy to a very large extent, and that even instinctive behaviors for many voters will be going that way, especially if the Islamists develop more or less towards some sort of modernization. And then the 4th project was what we have seen more or less in the Arab world in the last 30 or 40 years, which I have referred to repeatedly in my writings as distorted capitalism. So basically, no ideology, but effectively that we need to develop economically, we need to develop growth rates are by far more important than anything else. We need to work on infrastructure development and what have you, but sadly, the implementation of that ended up to be a very distorted form of capitalism. Some people use the word failure a lot, I think, in especially the first 2 interventions. I would not characterize the 4 projects as failure. I don't think so. I think the 4 of them had many achievements, actually. But certainly the fact that today we are in the situation we are in the Arab world, and certainly the fact that we have had for about half a century the waters of the Arab world not moving, means, to my mind at least, that these 4 projects, by and large, did not deliver on their initial premise, if you'd like. Something also happened, which I think was extremely interesting. And before 2011, in my opinion, it has been happening for 10 years, that the state structure, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, not in North Africa and not in the Gulf, but especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, has effectively crumbled. And again, even before 2010, 2011, the fact that a republic with the gravitas and the history of Syria passes its power from a father to a son in the way we have seen, I think many people would raise huge question marks on the idea of the Syrian Republic by that moment, by the idea of the Ba'ath Party, one of the founders, if you'd like, of Arab nationalism. The fact that Iraq, after a huge and rich experience of over 70, 80 years, which was very liberal. Sometimes people forget how liberal Iraq was in 1920s and 1930s. The fact that Iraq effectively ended being 3 distinct entities, to my mind, means that Lebanon is extremely divided. Anyway, so I think the Eastern Mediterranean order of the 60, 70 years, in my opinion, has crumbled from the early 2000s, let alone from 2011. So what I'm trying to say is that the 4 macro projects in the Arab world in the last 150 years did not really deliver, for different reasons. I'm not blaming them, but they did not really deliver. Partly as well, I think, for some international intervention, but also I think partly because of inherent failures. And the second point, one of the most important state structures in the Arab world, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think has crumbled. What that meant, I think, is that there were lots of fissures, lots of differences, lots of tensions, lots of injustices, and I really like and totally subscribe to the idea, lots of injustices that have been brewing in the Arab world for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, that were suppressed. Not suppressed by power, but just suppressed by the order of things. Just started to come to the fore, started to come to the surface. And then we had something that I think many people did not pay strong attention to, a demographic transformation of the Arab world that happened super quickly. When I was born, the Arab world was roughly 180 million people. The Arab world today is 330 million people plus. So in less than 40 years, the Arab world has added almost 160 million people. The vast majority of those are under 25 years old. Irrespective of your opinions of certain regimes, their socioeconomic life is miserable, the vast majority of them, in so many different ways, in jobs, in housing, in transportation, in accommodation, in finding visas internationally, in getting married. So there was lots of anger being built, lots of frustrations being built. And when you take into account 4 macro projects that did not deliver, take into account that one of the pillars of the Arab order has effectively crumbled, and take into account that all of this has been happening at a time when this demographic change was taking place at massive rapidness, these fissures started to come not just slowly, but come really very quickly to the surface, which I think is a huge part of the explanation behind what was referred to as the Arab, in my opinion, sadly and naively, as the Arab Spring. And then something interesting happened when elections started to take place, and some of the Western observers started to notice that, oops, the lovely, secular, young, Western-oriented guys we've seen in Tahrir or Habib Bourguiba Avenue or whatever did not really win elections. They were not coming to the surface. Rather, we are having different people coming to the surface. We started to hear notions of Arab winter. This is not really what we expected from the Arab world. My point is that the mess that many people are referring to, the uncertainty that people are referring to, it is part of a normal transformation in which huge fissures that have been suppressed in the Arab world for at least half a century, at least, is starting to open up at a moment of dramatic demographic transformation in the Arab world. But funny enough, this is not new. There is a word for that in political economy, which is called transitions. It just happens not to take place over 2 years or over 3 years. It happens normally over very long periods. I mean, you were talking at one point in time about transformation in France that took 100 years. I mean, hopefully it will not be that long in the Arab world, but obviously it should also not be a matter of looking at the Arab world and saying, well, we're now 3 years after the Arab Spring, so what happened? It's a huge, long transformation, but the foundations from which it is coming, I think, explain why it is a mess today. And by default, it will have to be very long and very messy because of these fissures coming to the fore. But let me end on 2 points to be slightly looking to the future, not just looking at the backwards. The demographics of the Arab world, I think, again, is really the story in the Arab world today. And part of the story is, I think, very perilous, very threatening, and part is potentially very positive. The perilous part, to my mind, is very economic in nature, which is out of the 160, the 170 million Arabs under 25 years old, the level of competitiveness in the international job market is extremely limited. Extremely limited, despite the talk of politicians. It's extremely limited. I'm very involved with the business world, with IFIs. The employability of very wide segments of those 160 million people is really limited. Sadly, even in their own private sector. That's a huge danger. And point number 2, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is the soft belly of the Arab world, I think, today, you have about 2 million refugees that nobody knows what to do with them, and most likely they're not coming home anytime soon. Most of them are very young. So across the Arab world, the employability of this huge demographic is a huge problem, but in the Eastern Mediterranean, it is even more complicated because of the nature of the refugees crisis evolving there. But there's a positive dimension as well. So in order not to be super gloomy, there is a positive side here. I have done some work with some of, for example, this is not advertising, for the British Council, for example, in parts of the Arab world, or for some of the linguistic training. Outside even the posh, the nice neighborhoods of Cairo or Amman or Casablanca, or certainly outside the glimmering, shining cities of the Gulf, in really unexpected places, in Said, southern Egypt, for example, or some of the northern parts of Jordan, which are very barren traditionally, you'd be surprised by the take-up of young Arabs taking lessons in English and in computer skills. I personally was very surprised. It's very high. And secondly, social entrepreneurship in the Arab world is increasingly very, not huge, but very interesting, especially in places like Morocco, Jordan, where more or less there is some sort of decent funding for these things. I see these things, these trends, as very positive because they have huge ripple effects on the ground. I was talking earlier this morning in a breakfast anyway, about the West looking at civil society in the Arab world and say, oh, we love the activists, we want to help the activists. All right, be my guest, help the activists. But the real civil society in the Arab world is not really the activists who talk to 2% of the Arab population. The real civil society in the Arab world are the ones who deal with the vast segments of the Arabs in the lower middle classes, which usually tend to be in professional syndicates, in labor associations, in farmer cooperatives, and in some of these social entrepreneurial groups. All of these things because they want jobs, because money is lacking, they are affecting quite positive change. I'm not saying the picture is positive. The picture remains very challenging because of the employability dimension I highlighted earlier. But I think this is an extremely important dynamic to look for. And the final point, so what? If some of the major transition stories today in the Arab world, Morocco, Egypt, to some extent Jordan, the Gulf, I think the Gulf is extremely important. If some of these, and I think the Gulf is changing actually in many ways, though we haven't touched on that in this conference. If these transition stories in the Arab world arrive not necessarily at wonderful liberal democracies, but arrive at some sort of sustainability that has the consent of the people, and arrive at a dynamic where big segments of their population, young populations, are employable sustainably, and that's the important point, employable sustainably, not just in touristic seasons that get blown away if there's a bomb or something, employable sustainably, then I think the Arab world can arrive at a state that we have seen in other parts of the world, such as Latin America, whereby it's not necessarily thriving, but it is on a gradual positive transition. If the political and the economic transitions do not deliver, especially on employment, sustainable employment, I think we will see by far more mess, and probably much bloodier than what we have seen right now.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Gilles Kepel comes from Sciences Po in Paris and has been studying the Arab world and especially Islam for many, many years. Gilles, please.
Thank you very much. I do not know whether my capacity as a Frenchman is what defines what I've been doing, but nevertheless, good morning and dobry den. The good news or the bad news that I wanted to tell you at the end for the wrap-up of this session is that there is no such thing as an Arab Spring. And that the problem with us, or many of us, when we're trying to deal with the issue of the region, is that instead of thinking the region in itself or trying to learn its languages and background, knowing about its cultural background, we tend to be infected by what I would call academically transmitted diseases coming from American campuses. One of them being what I call Fukuyamite, after Francis Fukuyama, whom you all know, The other one being Huntingtonosis after Sam Huntington. The Fukuyamite disease is the produced the Arab Spring byproduct, i.e., we're all equal. We're all like each other. I mean, like Tarek mentioned earlier on, those young activists, they just look like us. And, you know, after all, what's the difference between the Arab Spring and the Prague Spring? Well, had people thought it a little, thought it over a little more, they would have immediately understood that the Prague Spring did not end happily, at least at the time, but that it took quite a long time, a number of other years, so that it would bear fruition. So after everybody was disappointed, after Islamists came to power in regular elections, after violence spread over, after countries were shattered, we left the Fukuyama worldview, Weltanschauung, and shifted to the Huntingtonian Weltanschauung. There's no way. The Arabs really are not like us. I mean, let them remain in their otherness forever. And after all, after the bombings in Syria, after the massacres in Libya and so on, now we have Daesh, which is in a frenzy of beheading Westerners on YouTube, and who's taking people whom he believes are infidels in slavery, implementing in that what his members believe are the Holy Scriptures of the Quran. So where are we now? Is the Arab Spring or the Arab Autumn or whatever the beginning of this whole story, or is it only a continuation, an outcome of a movement of someone said that the Arab, in the panel, the Arab world was in construction. Well, it is, if it is in construction, it is also in destruction. And a destruction of the prevalent world system that had been engineered a century ago after World War I, which was characterized by the Sykes-Picot Agreement and also in its wake, the Balfour Declaration. What I believe is that for reasons which are were largely put into perspective by Tarek Osman before me, the huge transformations of the Arab world, its demographic explosion, its system of power, which remained completely autocratic in a large extent, has led not only to the challenging of the powers that be there, which looked like what happened by late 2010 and early 2011, but it led to a whole deconstruction of the whole building that was built after World War I, and so this is something that we have to tackle. Let me suggest a few ways out of it for the sake of discussion, but I'm not sure there is much left for the Q&A session. Many people, and Salam Fayyad warned us against that, would equate the problems of the Arab world with Islam and say that Islam is the reason why things are not going well. Why is it that the Arab world is not following the path that was followed before it by South America, for instance? It's because of Islam. And of course, the Daesh people cater into that for a lot. Well, I don't know to what extent Islam is the matter, or to what extent the interpretation of Islam is the matter, and who controls its interpretation is probably a problem, whether it be in the Sunni world or in the Shia world. And this is something which definitely has to be questioned. But I would say that the major problem for the region is the fact that it has played, and is still playing such a quintessential role in the production of energy for the planet. And the fact that a number of societies in the Arab world and of state-society relations in the Arab worlds could not function normally, if I may say so, because there was the oil rent that was destroying everything in terms of the fabric of civil society, I think is a major issue. Autocratic regimes could perfectly buy off social peace, not make the many reforms that all of you mentioned, not enfranchise the components of society, because at the end of the day, there was always be a check payable in petrodollars that would ease the problems and dissimulate the wounds. And I believe that the price which is being paid now is largely the price of this oil disease. If the Arab world is sick of something, it's sick of its oil. And of the facile way oil allowed for people to address pressing social problems. The fact that reforms could be not implemented, if I may say so, because there was always a paycheck. And that was not only the case for oil-producing countries, which I believe are also in dire straits. We have no one from the GCC, from the Arabian Gulf states here, but the GCC today also is in serious trouble. Two of its members, the United Arab Emirates on the one hand and Qatar on the other, are fighting a proxy war in Libya, each of them helping one of the camps and bombing each other. So we mentioned that already yesterday in the other panel on the Middle East. And this calls into question the very future of the Gulf Cooperation Council as a provider for the Arab system, which of course opens the possibility for a major role played by Turkey and Iran, and this is something that former Secretary General of the Arab League, Amr Moussa, mentioned yesterday with some anxiety. Now, if we look at the bad news, definitely, as many of you mentioned, there are a lot of bad news in the Middle Eastern part of the Arab world. The quagmire and the deadlock in Palestine was eloquently addressed by Prime Minister Fayyad, and our friend Falah from Kurdistan also pinpointed the fragmentation of the Levant society. I would like to go back to the first contribution by Ambassador Amrani and wonder why things are not going as bad in North Africa as they are going in the rest of the Arab world. Some of you say it's because they speak French. It's not only for that reason. It's also because the North African system has been, except for Algeria maybe, far less dependent on oil than was the case in the Middle East. And I'll go back to Algeria in a minute. And what happened, what are the peculiarities of Algeria. Tunisia, for instance, we talked about Morocco already, so I will skip it. Tunisia, for instance, as some of you mentioned, was the only place where a revolution or a toppling of the Ancien regime happened, and where you are not now facing chaos. Why is that? I believe it's because in Tunisia, there is a rather strong middle class, which is quite well educated, both in Arabic and in French, actually, and which has taken the revolution into its own hands, and which is controlling the process. And this middle class includes secularists, and it includes also some of the Islamists of the Nahda, which, whenever I see them, are always so keen to tell me they have nothing to do with the Egyptian Muslim brothers. Maybe because they fear the stick of the army, but there is no such a big army in Tunisia anyway. So this is something which is extremely important, I believe. The fact that there you have a civil society which functions differently than the one in many other Middle Eastern countries, where it exists, but it is too weak. And also the fact that the North African economy, the North African social system is so much turned towards Europe is also a case in point and has to be taken in consideration. If you look at a map of airlines from North Africa to the rest of the world, you'll see that most of them are going to Europe, not to the Middle East. That's one thing which I believe has to be taken into consideration and maybe could provide food for thought for future developments in the region. I mentioned Algeria. Algeria, of course, is a regime which is aging, as everybody knows, and where one of the reasons why there was a limited amount of turmoil in 2011 is that many people in Algeria thought that they had been through this movie before. The 1990s in Algeria were a terrible decade with, we don't know exactly, 100,000, 200,000, sorry for the inexactitude, death. And dead, people who died, whether they were killed by the security forces or mostly by the radical Islamists, the jihadists. And this, I believe, was used as a sort of vaccine by many people in Algeria, saying that they want change, but they're very hesitant about radical ways to undergo that change, because in 1989 in Algeria, the revolutionary process had started as a secular, pacific, whatever movement, and ended in bloodshed, civil strife, and jihadism a few years later. So, therefore, I believe that if we want to put this whole story right, we should not start with the Arab so-called Spring as a defining moment. This is something that we can leave to think tanks in the Beltway, but this has nothing to do with what is happening in the region. What we have to put into perspective is the whole process, the sort of tectonic change which is taking place nowadays in the Middle East, and where we see that North Africa, as of now, is showing maybe a more satisfactory way out. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are now, I have a problem as a chairman because we have to wrap it up now because we're already 5 minutes behind our schedule. On the other hand, I was very glad that we were very much enriched, and this is why I didn't impose time limits, despite the fact that we asked originally all the participants to speak to 5 to 7 minutes, but it became 5 to 7 minutes Middle Eastern time, and I think we were all grateful for this. So unless somebody has something very urgent to say and comment, I think we should thank our panelists. Let me just Professor, very briefly, if it is a very short comment and a question.
I would just like to thank Tarek Osman for raising a very important point during this debate, which is that what the Arab Spring brought as a positive development and what is happening in this region as a positive, something that the Arab Spring, whatever we want to call it or accept it, has actually brought. And this is actually the activity of people in the regions, and it's those Western or pro-Western activists who have actually realized that they have to reach out beyond their scope, and they have gone through a learning process, I think, as well. And we cannot avoid this fact. And I think I understand that on the level of this panel, we are discussing a very strategic level. But I believe that perhaps not in 3 years, perhaps not in 5 years, this will actually have some impact. And I think we should take this also into account and perhaps include some of these people who have come to that very same realization in that debate. So I take just the word to speak on perhaps their behalf. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is as a comment. I don't know whether anybody would like to respond to that, but I think we really have to wrap it up. Let me just very briefly make 3 comments, what I think we have learned. First of all, we have learned about the extreme complexity and pluralism in the region. One cannot speak about the Arab world. Each country, each society is different, and one has to know about its history and its specific issues, and therefore the great differences between countries in the Maghreb and countries in the Mashraq, and within the Middle East in the narrow sense, of course, between different countries. The second issue, which I think we'll learn, is that the model of the unitary nation-state is not the only model. It has lasted for a relatively long time in the area, post-World War I, basically. But it is now changing, unraveling, and we are looking for developments which are very much unforeseen. And the last issue that one has to look very carefully at what's happening on the, especially now in ISIS and the terrible things done there, and not fall into the trap of demonizing Islam and seeing Islam as a monolithic entity. There are possibilities, there are developments. We heard about Morocco, we heard about the kind of pluralism in the Kurdish region, and I think we can learn from that. Let me make, coming from Jerusalem, from Al-Quds, let me make a statement about some things that did not happen. I don't think that what I'm going to say is going to be a model, but it's important to realize. Last week, and it happens only once in 37 years, Yom Kippur, the Jewish day of fast, happened on the same day of Eid al-Adha, which is a great festival which has to do with a lot of eating, among other things, because it's a day of the sacrifice. And there was great nervousness in Israel, especially in mixed cities like Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Jaffa, Acre, Haifa. What will happen if you have a situation in which Jews who are fasting are going to confront masses of Muslims who are feasting at the same time? And there were a number of ways of addressing it. Obviously, the police, and I don't want to idealize the Israeli police, it's sometimes a very nasty police. The police took some measures, but what was much more important was that on the eve of Yom Kippur and the eve of Eid al-Adha, we had joint communiques from rabbis and imams calling to respect and understand what the other community is doing. On Eid al-Adha, 40,000 people prayed under difficult conditions, and the situation in Israel and the occupied territories is now obviously a complex one and not a very good one. 40,000 Muslims prayed on the Dome of the Rock at Haram al-Sharif, including a few hundreds who came for the first time after 6 years from Gaza. Now, this is not a model. This is not the only reality in our immediate region. There are some other realities which are pretty bad, especially during and after the Gaza war. But the fact that despite the current tension, and it's a very bad mood now, on the Israeli side as well as on the Palestinian side, that this could happen. And you could have imams and rabbis talking to each other and talking together to their respective community suggests that if there is a will, there is a way, and perhaps in the future we will see more of this rather than the kind of conflict to which we have been subjected in the last few years. Let me thank all of you, and let me thank our panelists who gave us a lot of elements of wisdom and thinking, and let's meet soon again, perhaps in a slightly better atmosphere. Thank you very much.
Congratulations.